The lantern light came through the shuttered window in a single thin line, warm and steady against the dark stone outside. From the road below, from the trail that wound up through the spruce and the old pine, from any angle a traveler might approach Black Fern Pass on a cold Colorado night, there was nothing to see. Only rock, only shadow, only the patient green of fern pressed flat against the cliff face by the evening wind. But behind 30 feet of solid mountain, a fire burned, and a family sat down to supper on their own land, under their own roof, for the first time in their lives. 6 weeks before that night, the Holt family had owned nothing that could not be loaded into a single wagon. That had seemed like enough. It wasn't. Ridgeback, Colorado, April 1896. The town had grown faster than anyone planned for and slower than anyone hoped. 2 years ago, it had been a scattering of canvas tents, a single dry goods counter, and a mud street that turned to gravel only near the post office because the postmaster had paid for the gravel himself and made sure everyone knew it. Now Ridgeback had a church frame going up on the eastern rise, a proper hotel with glass in every window, and 4 streets of permanent buildings that cast real shadows in the afternoon sun. The rents had grown with it. Orrin Holt worked timber. He was broad through the chest, steady with an axe, and the kind of man a foreman valued because he arrived before the bell rang and never needed to be told the same thing twice. He brought home enough most months, enough to cover what the family needed, enough to keep the arithmetic from becoming a crisis if Hester managed it carefully, which she always did. They rented 2 rooms above a feed merchant's storage on Birch Street. The ceiling was low and the walls were thin, and in winter the cold came through the boards in the night like a presence that had decided to stay. In July, the heat from the storage below rose through the floorboards and turned the rooms into something close to unbearable. The smell of grain dust and mice was constant, a background note to every meal, every conversation, every quiet moment at the end of a long day. It was not a good place to live. Hester made it one anyway. That was her particular gift. Not the gift of making things beautiful, though she could do that too with almost nothing. It was something more fundamental than beauty. It was the gift of making a place feel inhabited by people who cared about it. She hung a square of blue cloth over the window that faced the alley, and the alley disappeared. She kept a tin cup of dried wildflowers on the shelf above the cookstove, columbine and Indian paintbrush she'd gathered from the slope east of town the previous summer, and the shelf became something other than a shelf. She arranged the 3 books they owned on the windowsill so the spines faced outward, and the room had a library. She was 32 years old with pale hair. She kept pinned back and hands that were never quite clean because there was always something that needed doing, and the water for washing was always needed for something else first. She was not a woman who talked about how hard things were. She was a woman who looked at how hard things were, calculated what could be done about it, and began doing it before anyone thought to ask her. Orrin loved her the way a man loves something he knows he does not fully understand, gratefully, carefully, with the awareness that the thing he loved was larger than his understanding of it. The girls were 6 years old and identical in every visible way, the same bright blonde hair, the same gap in their front teeth from a winter cold that had lasted 6 weeks and left them both with a whistle in their breath when they laughed. The same habit of reaching for each other's hand when something startled them, a reflex so old and automatic that neither of them seemed aware they did it. Nora was the one who asked questions, not occasionally, constantly, about everything. About why the feed merchant's horse was brown on one side and lighter on the other. About what happened to the sun at night when it went behind the mountains. About whether the mice in the walls had names and whether the mice knew that the people above them had names. She asked questions the way other children breathed without deciding to, without stopping. May was the one who listened. She stored things up behind her dark eyes and thought about them later, turning them over in a private interior space that no one else had access to. When May finally spoke about something, it was usually 3 days after the event that had caused the thought, and it was always exactly right. Orrin sometimes looked at his younger daughter with an expression that was not quite unease, but was close to it. The feeling of being understood by someone who had not yet learned to be diplomatic about it. They had made a life in those 2 rooms, not a large life, not a comfortable one, but a real one full of small routines and small dawns, and the ordinary warmth of 4 people who knew each other down to the grain. Then the letter came. Hester found out 3 days before it arrived. She had gone down to the ground floor to borrow the feed merchant's wife's measuring cup, the same exchange they made every Thursday when Hester baked and Mrs. Aldridge used her cup for something else, without remembering to return it. She was standing in the narrow hall at the bottom of the stairs when she heard the landlord's voice through the thin wall of the merchant's office. He was talking to someone. His voice was low, but Hester had spent 2 years listening through thin walls, and she heard well. He was selling, not raising the rent, not adjusting terms, selling the entire block of Birch Street to the Consolidated Mountain Mining Company, which was buying up residential properties along the western edge of Ridgeback as preparation for expanding their processing operation. The sale required the buildings to be vacated by the 1st of May. The landlord was planning to notify residents with a letter citing a rent increase because a rent increase was legal, and an eviction without cause was more complicated. Hester stood in the hall and listened until the voice stopped. Then she went back upstairs with the measuring cup she had not asked for and was not sure Mrs. Aldridge had intended to lend her. She sat at the table and looked at the blue cloth on the window for a long time. She did not tell Orrin that evening. She needed to think first. She needed to understand what she was working with before she brought it to him, because Orrin was a man who handled the problems in front of him with great steadiness and considerable skill. And what Hester needed right now was not steadiness applied to the wrong version of the problem. She spent 3 days thinking. She looked at the numbers from every angle she could construct. What they had saved, which was not much. What they could borrow, which was almost nothing, because the people she might ask had their own versions of this problem. What was available to rent in Ridgeback at a price Orrin's wages could meet with 2 small children and a winter coming, which turned out, after careful inquiry conducted over those 3 days, with the careful casualness of a woman who had learned to ask questions, without appearing to need the answers, to be almost nothing. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning, written in the landlord's careful, apologetic hand. Orrin read it standing at the foot of the stairs. He read it twice. Then he folded it and put it in his coat pocket and came upstairs and sat at the table and looked at the numbers the way he looked at a difficult piece of timber trying to find the grain. He told Hester that evening after the girls were in their bunks. He unfolded the letter and laid it flat on the table and read the relevant numbers aloud. Hester looked at the numbers. She looked at her hands. Then she looked at him. "I know," she said. "I've been thinking." He looked up. "I heard 3 days ago," she said, "through the wall. He's not raising the rent. He's selling to the mining company. The letter is to make it look like a legal notice instead of an eviction." Orrin was quiet for a moment. She could see him reorganizing what he'd understood to be the situation. He was good at that, at absorbing new information without resisting it. One of the things she had always valued in him. "So the 30 days, he said, is real, but the reason isn't. Does it matter for what we do next?" "No," she said, "but it might matter later. Keep the letter." He put it back in his coat pocket. "I talked to the Halverson woman on Crane Street," Hester said, "and the widow Mapes, and the woman at the dry goods counter who has the room above the tannery she sometimes rents. There's nothing in Ridgeback at our price that will take us with the girls." She said this the way she said most difficult things, straight and without softening, because softening difficult things only made them take longer to understand, and the time spent understanding them was time not spent solving them. "I've been trying to find another answer for 3 days. I don't have one." Orrin nodded slowly. "We have until the 1st of May, he said. 18 days. He got up and stood at the window that faced the alley, looking at the blue cloth she'd hung there years ago, which he sometimes forgot was cloth and thought was simply the color of that particular wall. "I'll talk to the other landlords tomorrow," he said. "I already did," she said. "Kepner on 4th won't take children. The place on Sutter is gone. The mill foreman took it last week. The room above Calloway's is above a saloon and no place for girls." She paused. "I'm not saying this to discourage you. I'm saying it because I think we need to look somewhere else." "Where?" Sure. She was quiet for a moment. "I don't know yet," she said, "but somewhere." The 3 weeks that followed were the kind of weeks that leave marks, not visible ones, the kind that change the way a person holds themselves when they walk into a room where they are about to ask for something. Orrin talked to both remaining landlords in Ridgeback and was turned away, not rudely but firmly. He considered the mining camp west of town and mentioned it to Hester in the cautious way a man mentions a thing he already knows is wrong. Hester looked at him in a way that required no words. He considered heading south toward Pueblo, where land was cheaper and the railroad had opened up new work. But moving meant spending what little they'd saved, arriving somewhere new with empty pockets and no contacts in a town that owed them nothing. Hester kept the girls in their routine. Lessons at the pine table in the morning with a stick of charcoal and pieces of smooth bark she'd collected from behind the feed merchants. Reading in the afternoon from the 3 books on the windowsill. A walk in the evening down Birch Street and back, during which Nora asked approximately 40 questions about everything she observed, and May walked with her hand in Hester's and said almost nothing. On the evening of the last day of April, they packed what they owned. It did not take long. The blue cloth came down from the window. Hester folded it with the same care she always folded it, though this time she was aware in the way you become aware of ordinary gestures when they are becoming final of each fold. The tin cup of wildflowers was wrapped in a piece of newspaper and tucked into the side of a crate. The 3 books went into a canvas bag. The cookware was nested. The extra blankets were rolled. Nora and May each packed their own small bundle without being told to a blanket, a wooden toy, a pair of extra stockings. They carried their bundles down the stairs and sat in the wagon bed and did not ask questions about where they were going because children understand when seriousness is required of them. Nora reached for May's hand. May was already reaching. Orrin stood on the Birch Street curb with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man standing at the edge of something he cannot see the bottom of. Hester came down the stairs last. She had gone back up once after the wagon was loaded, not because she'd forgotten anything, but because she needed a moment alone in the empty rooms. She stood in the center of the room that had been their front room and looked at the rectangle of lighter color on the wall where the blue cloth had blocked the sunlight for 2 years. The room had nothing left of them in it. It looked like what it had always been, which was someone else's space that they had borrowed for a while. She went back down. She climbed up onto the wagon bench beside Orrin and settled her hands in her lap. "Ready," he said. She thought about that question. "Yes," she said, which was not exactly true, but was the truest answer available. Orrin shook the reins. The horse moved forward. The letter was waiting at the post office. They had stopped to return the key to the landlord's box and collect one final piece of mail that Hester had been expecting a receipt from a hat order she'd placed in February for a customer in town who had money for such things. She went in while Orrin waited with the girls. The postmaster handed her 2 envelopes, the receipt she'd expected, and a second envelope heavier addressed in a law clerk's formal hand with a return address from an office in Glenwood Springs. She read it standing at the postal counter. It was brief, written in the careful, neutral language of legal correspondence. A man named Edmund Greer had died in March 1896, the clerk wrote, leaving no living children or named heirs closer than a third cousin twice removed, which was Orrin Holt through the maternal line. The connection was thin and distant, but it was legal. Edmund Greer had left a deed. The property was described as 37 acres on the eastern slope of Black Fern Pass, bounded by stone and timber, with one structure of uncertain condition. The clerk noted with what seemed like professional sympathy that the land had not been assessed in over a decade and was not considered to be of significant value. Hester read the letter twice. Then she looked up at the wall behind the postal counter, which had a framed picture of the Colorado state seal on it, and thought for a moment. Then she reached back into the envelope to fold the letter away, and her fingers found something else. A smaller envelope, unsealed, tucked inside the larger one so flat against the fold that she had missed it the first time. She would not have found it at all if she had not by habit checked every fold of every envelope before putting it away, because Hester was a woman who did not leave things to chance when she could help it. The smaller envelope had no address on it, no name. She opened it carefully. One page, written in a slow, deliberate hand that was not the law clerk's hand, not the measured script of a man accustomed to legal language, but the careful penmanship of a man who wrote rarely and took his time when he did. To whoever finds this land worth finding. I built the place for reasons that seemed good at the time. I leave it to someone young enough to use it and stubborn enough to look past what first appears. E. Greer. Hester read it once. Then she read it again. She folded it carefully and put it in her coat pocket, separate from the legal letter, which she put in her other pocket. Then she went back out to the wagon. She climbed up onto the bench. Orrin looked at her. She handed him the legal letter. He read it once, lips moving slightly on the numbers. He read it again. He looked up at the mountains to the north and west, where Black Fern Pass was visible as a notch between two dark peaks that leaned together like an arch. 37 acres, he said, and a structure of uncertain condition. Yes, he was quiet for a moment. It's something, he said. It's the only something we have, Hester said. And then I think we should go. He looked at her. She had the way she held herself when she had already decided something. He'd learned to read that posture over 8 years of marriage. Her back was straight, and her hands were still, and she was looking at the mountains with the particular quality of attention that meant she was not looking at what was in front of her, but at what was going to be there. All right, he said. He shook the reins. The horse turned north. She did not tell him about the second letter, not yet. She put her hand in her coat pocket and felt the folded paper there and thought about a man named Edmund Greer who had built something on a difficult piece of land and then chosen at the end of his life to leave it to a stranger. Not any stranger, someone stubborn enough to look past what first appears. She watched the mountains come closer. The road to Black Fern Pass was not much of a road. It had been one once. The evidence of old wagon traffic was still visible in places beneath the pine needle mulch and the spring mud, but no one had kept it up in years, and the mountain had been quietly reclaiming it one season at a time. Orrin drove slowly, leaning forward on the bench. The girls in the back had stopped asking where they were going and were watching the trees instead, which had grown taller and older and further apart as the altitude climbed. The rain came an hour past the last visible farmstead. Not heavy rain, a cold, patient drizzle that silvered the pine branches and made the rock outcroppings along the trail shine like dull pewter. Hester pulled a canvas tarp across the wagon bed to keep the crates dry. May pressed close against her side when she leaned back. Nora stuck her hand out to catch raindrops, and Hester drew it gently back in without looking. By mid-afternoon, they had climbed high enough that the air tasted different, cleaner, colder, with a mineral edge that came off the stone and made the inside of the lungs feel washed. The pass was visible now as that dark notch between the peaks. The deed had described a trail marker, a post with a notch cut into its south face, and Orrin found it half hidden by a young alder that had grown up beside it in the years since anyone had kept the trail clear. He turned the wagon off the road onto what was barely a track, two faint lines in the ground running toward a wall of dark rock and dense spruce. He brought the wagon to a stop at the base of a wide rock face that rose perhaps 30 feet before it gave way to a jumble of boulders and old-growth tree. The rain tapped on the canvas. The horse stood patient and unimpressed. Orrin climbed down and walked the base of the cliff. He had spent 15 years reading ground, reading the way water moved through stone and the way plants tracked moisture and shelter. He was looking for what the land was telling him, moving slowly along the base of the rock face. Hester sat on the wagon bench and watched him. She had the second letter in her pocket, and she was thinking about the word stubborn, and whether it was intended as a warning or a compliment, and whether for Edmund Greer there had been any difference between the two. Nora appeared beside her on the bench. She had climbed forward from the wagon bed with the efficiency of a child who had spent considerable time learning to move through small spaces. "What's Papa looking for?" she asked. "He'll know it when he finds it," Hester said. She was right. Orrin stopped. He stood very still for a moment, about 40 feet from where the wagon sat. Then he pushed aside a curtain of dark hanging fern and crouched and looked at something. Hester could not see what it was from the wagon. She watched him stand again and reach up to push the fern further aside. He held his palm flat against the rock face. He turned back toward the wagon. "Bring the lantern," he called. She climbed down. She took the lantern from the wagon box and lit it with the matches she kept in her coat, the same pocket as the second letter, and she walked toward him across the wet ground. He stepped aside when she reached him and showed her what he'd found. A crack in the rock, vertical, perhaps 2 feet wide at the base, narrowing as it rose. Half hidden by the curtain of fern he'd pushed aside in the deep shadow of an overhang above. She looked at it and felt the cold air moving from the space beyond it, not the damp cold of exposed mountain air, but a still enclosed cold that smelled of old wood and dry earth and something faintly like pine smoke from another age. She pushed the lantern through the gap first. She saw dark stone, then beyond the stone open air, a sheltered space perhaps 20 feet across, and beyond that built into the wall of rock itself as though the mountain had grown at a cabin. She stood with the lantern through the gap for one long moment. Then she withdrew the lantern, turned to Orin, and felt something move in her chest that she did not have an immediate word for. Something between recognition and relief, the feeling of finding a thing she had not known she was looking for. Orin, she said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. Bring the girls. He brought them one at a time. Nora first, then May. Then he came through himself and took the lantern from Hester and held it up so they could all see. The cabin was low and wide, built from split logs the color of dark honey, with a roof that sloped back against the cliff face and was covered entirely in deep green moss. The rock overhang above it formed a natural porch dry and swept clean by decades of wind running along the cliff face. The walls were solid, no visible rot, no leaning. The door was latched shut and held by a length of leather cord looped over a wooden peg. May walked to the door without being asked. She looked at the leather cord. She looked back at her mother. Hester nodded. May lifted the cord off the peg and pushed the door. It swung open without protest, as though it had been kept oiled, as though it had been opened and closed recently, as though someone had not so very long ago stood where they were standing and done exactly what they were doing. The smell that came from inside was dry and still and very old. Beeswax and wood ash and the faint sweetness of dried herbs tied in bunches from the ceiling beams. Hester raised the lantern and stepped through the doorway. One room, a stone hearth along the back wall wide enough to cook in with iron hooks still hanging in place above the firebox. A rough pine table with two benches. Two wooden bunks built into the left wall, the rope webbing still strung between the frames taut and even. Shelves along the right wall holding a row of sealed tin canisters, a folded piece of oilcloth, 3 candles, a hand axe with a hickory handle, a ball of hemp cord, and a tin lantern. A small window cut into the front wall, its shutter hanging closed but hinged and intact. Nora walked to the center of the room and turned in a slow circle, looking at everything with the systematic seriousness of a child conducting an inventory. Someone lived here, she said. Yes, Hester said. A long time ago. A long time ago. Is he gone? He is. He left it to us. May had gone to the hearth. She crouched in front of it and looked up into the flue. Then she reached forward and pressed 2 fingers into the ash on the hearthstone. She held her fingers there for a moment. Then she looked back at Hester with an expression that was not alarm, but something more like careful attention. It's warm, May said. Hester crossed the room in 4 steps and crouched beside her daughter. She pressed her own hand flat against the hearthstone. The stone was cold, but the ash. She pressed her fingers into the gray pile the way May had, and felt beneath the surface, beneath the top layer of cold gray powder, a faint warmth. Not the warmth of a recent fire. The warmth of a fire from days ago held in the deep ash the way a hell breath holds heat. Someone had burned a fire in this hearth within the last 2 weeks. Edmund Greer had died in March. Hester did not move for a moment. She stayed crouched beside her younger daughter, with her fingers in the warm ash, and looked at the hearthstone and thought. She looked around the room again, this time differently. The shelves, the floor, the table. She was not looking at the age of things now. She was looking at the dust, or rather at the absence of it. The shelves held a fine layer of dust, but not the thick, undisturbed accumulation of 30 years. The floor had been swept. The table had been wiped. Recently. Within weeks, not years. Someone had been here after Edmund Greer died. Someone had kept this place. She stood up. She looked at May, who was watching her with those dark eyes that missed nothing and forgot nothing. Don't say anything yet, Hester said quietly. Not to hide it, but because she needed to understand it first, and she needed to do that alone the way she did most things that required real thinking. She would tell Orin, just not this moment when he was standing in the doorway with the lantern and the girls were turning circles and the whole weight of the last 3 weeks was still settling. May looked at her steadily. Then she looked at the hearth. Then she looked back at her mother and gave a single small nod, the nod of someone who understands that some things require waiting before they can be spoken, and who is willing to wait. Hester put her hand on her daughter's shoulder for a moment. Then she stood and turned to face the room. Her room, her family's room, their first real room, and she said, "Let's make a fire." Orin found a wood pile against the rock wall outside under the overhang. He split kindling while Hester swept the cabin floor with a branch of dry fern she found leaning against the outside wall. The girls carried small armloads of firewood through the crack in the rock and with great ceremony passing pieces back and forth with the gravity of important work. Hester opened the tin canisters: cornmeal, dried beans, salt, a paper packet of pepper sealed with wax. Good. She closed each lid carefully and set them back on the shelf in the same order she had found them, and wondered, not for the first time and not for the last, about the man who had placed them there. By the time full dark came down the pass, the hearth was lit. The chimney drew cleanly, which was a small miracle of its own, and meant something about how well the cabin had been maintained. The warm light reached every corner of the single room. Hester warmed the dried beans in the iron pot and added salt and a broken piece of dried cornbread from their crate, and the four of them ate together at the pine table with the lantern burning between them. Outside, the rain continued its cold, patient conversation with the stone. In here, it could not reach them. After supper, Orrin took the deed from his coat pocket and unfolded it on the table. He smoothed it flat with his palm and read it again in the firelight. 37 acres, his name on the document. The land surveyor's marks along the margin in faded ink. He had never owned anything that could not be loaded in a wagon. He folded the deed carefully and set it on the shelf beside the 3 candles. Hester watched him do it. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. He turned his hand over and held on. The girls were already in their bunks, May with her eyes closed and Nora still watching the firelight move on the ceiling. "Nora," Hester said. "I know," Nora said. "Sleep. Sleep. I'm not tired." "That's all right. You can be awake. Just quiet." A pause. The fire settled. The rain moved across the cliff face above them in a sound like someone turning pages in another room. "Mama," Nora said. When the man lived here, was he lonely?" Hester thought about the warm ash under her fingers, the swept floor, the wiped table. She thought about a man who had built this place and kept it going, and then at the very end made arrangements for it to be ready for someone he had never met. "I think he was," she said, "for a long time. That's sad, yes, but he gave it to us." "He did." Another pause. The fire. "That was good of him," Nora said with the simple finality of a child who has reached a conclusion she finds satisfactory and does not need to complicate. "It was," Hester said. She sat at the table long after the girls were asleep. Orrin's breathing had steadied in the bunk behind her. The fire had settled to a deep red pulse that threw no shadows, only warmth. She took the second letter from her coat pocket. She unfolded it on the table in front of her and read it again by the light of the single remaining candle. "To whoever finds this land worth finding." She thought about that phrase. Whoever finds this land worth finding. Not whoever inherits, not whoever arrives, whoever finds it worth finding. As though the land had an opinion about who deserved it, as though the test was not who showed up, but what they were willing to see. She thought about the warm ash, about whoever had come here after Edmund Greer died and swept the floor and wiped the table and laid a fire and kept this place ready. Ready for them, though they had not known they were coming. Ready for someone. She folded the letter again and held it in her hands. Stubborn enough to look past what first appears, she put the letter back in her pocket. She looked at her family sleeping in the firelight. Orrin's broad shoulders in the lower bunk. May's small dark head barely visible above the blanket. Nora's pale hair spread across the pillow. She looked at the deed on the shelf beside the candles. Then she got up quietly and put another piece of wood on the fire, a careful piece, one that would hold through the early hours, and she went to the bunk and lay down beside the girls, one on each side of her, warm and heavy with sleep. Outside, the rain kept falling on 37 acres of mountain land that belonged to them. Hester Holt lay in the firelight and listened to it and did not sleep for a long time, and was not unhappy about that. There was too much to think about, and she had always done her best thinking at the edge of sleep in that particular quiet where the day's noise finally stopped and the real questions could be heard. The real question, the one she turned over in the dark until the fire had burned down to coals and the rain had gentled and May had shifted in sleep and pressed closer, was not whether this place could be made livable. She already knew it could. The question was, who had made sure it was ready? The first morning on the mountain was cold and clear and full of work. Hester was up before anyone else, which was how she preferred it. The coals in the hearth still held enough heat to catch a twist of dry bark, and she had a small fire going before the light outside the shuttered window had changed from black to gray. She stood over the iron pot and listened to the cabin breathe around her, the sound of her family sleeping, the sound of the mountain outside, which was not silence, but something textured and alive, wind moving through spruce needles, water finding its way down the rock face of birds somewhere above the tree line calling out a single clear note and then going quiet. She had spent the last hour of the previous night lying in the dark making lists. She did this when the problems were large, not writing them down. She had no paper to spare. She made the lists in her head, organized them by urgency, then by what she could control and what she could not, and then by what needed Oren's hands and what needed only her own. By the time she finally slept, she had a reasonable picture of the first week and a rougher picture of the first month, and she felt, if not calm, at least oriented, the way a navigator feels after taking a bearing. You still have the whole sea in front of you, but you know which direction is which. The problems were substantial. The roof, which looked solid from below, needed examination from above. The food supply in the tins would last perhaps 2.5 weeks at careful rationing, and they had brought additional provisions from Ridgeback, but not enough. The horse needed shelter that the narrow sheltered space outside the crack in the wall did not adequately provide, especially if the weather turned serious. The spring was somewhere on the property, the deed had mentioned it, but she did not yet know where, which meant they were relying on the rain barrel she'd found under the overhang and what they'd carried in their own canisters. And the money. The money was the one that woke her up fully when she let herself think about it. They had what Oren had brought home from his last 2 weeks at the mill, enough to buy provisions for a month, maybe 6 weeks if she was ruthless about it. After that, the land would need to be producing something, or Oren would need to be earning somewhere, and neither of those things could happen quickly enough to be comfortable. She heard May shift in the bunk, and then the particular quality of silence that meant the child was awake and thinking. "Mama," May said quietly so as not to wake the others. "Morning, little one. Is this still our house?" "It is." A pause. May processing. "It was still our house when I was asleep." "Houses don't stop being houses when you're asleep," Hester said. "That's rather the point of them." May appeared in the firelight blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her dark hair loose and uncombed. She came and stood beside Hester at the cook stove and looked up at the bunches of dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beams and the row of tin canisters on the shelf and the deed sitting beside the 3 candles exactly where Oren had placed it the night before. "Edmund Greer," May said. She had apparently been thinking about the name since someone had said it. "That's right." "Where did he go?" "He died, sweetheart, in March." May thought of Moss. "Did he know we were coming?" Hester looked at her daughter. "What makes you ask that?" May looked at the hearth, then back at Hester. The ash, she meant. She had not forgotten. She was 6 years old, and she had not forgotten for a single minute. "I think he might have," Hester said carefully. May accepted this with the equanimity of a child who has already suspected the answer and is merely having it confirmed. She leaned against Hester's side. Hester put an arm around her small shoulders and held her there, and watched the fire and thought about Edmund Greer, who had died in March, and someone else who had swept the floor afterward and kept the ash warm and said nothing to anyone about it. By the time Oren and Nora were up and the beans were heated and the morning was fully underway, Hester had decided something. She would find out who it was. Quietly in her own time, through observation and through whatever conversations came naturally. She would not alarm Oren before she understood what she was dealing with. The cabin was theirs legally and structurally and in every way that mattered. But the story of this place was not finished yet, and she intended to understand it before it surprised her. The first week was harder than that first evening had made it seem. On the third day, the rain came back, a real rain this time, not the patient drizzle of their arrival, but something with weight and intention behind it. And by mid-afternoon, Hester had found 3 places where water was working through the roof and darkening the interior wall logs. She stood under each spot in turn and held up a candle to look at the ceiling, marking the locations in her mind. None of them were emergencies. All of them would become emergencies if left alone through another season. She told Oren that evening, matter-of-factly, the way she told him most things. He was on the roof the next morning before the rain had fully stopped working, with a bundle of moss he'd cut from the rock face below, pressing the layers back together with his hands in the thin spots, working in short stretches while the last of the rain moved through in waves. Hester passed material up to him through the open window and kept the girls occupied inside and tried not to watch the way he moved across the slope of the roof with the particular careful confidence of a large man who knows exactly how far he can trust a surface. May's cough started on the second day of rain. It was the damp air and the altitude Hester knew. A respiratory irritation, not an infection, nothing that needed more than management. But a cough that sounds worse than it is still sounds bad, and especially from a 6-year-old, especially in the middle of the night. Hester made a steam tent from the iron pot and a piece of canvas and sat with May through 2 evenings in the long hours between them, keeping the steam gentle and consistent, singing in a low voice until the coughing settled and the small body beside her finally relaxed into sleep. She did not complain about the lost sleep. Complaining about lost sleep was a luxury for people who had other options. Nora, for her part, took May's illness as an opportunity to be exceptionally helpful, which she demonstrated by reorganizing the tin canisters on the shelf in what she described as a better order, asking Hester 37 questions in the space of a single morning, and explaining to the horse through the gap in the rock wall that her sister was sick and would be better soon, and that they should all try to be quiet. The horse appeared unmoved by this information. The horse was in fact the next significant problem. The sheltered space outside the crack was too exposed in a driving rain and too narrow for the animal to move comfortably. Orrin scouted the land immediately east of the rock face and found a natural shelf of ground backed by a low cliff deep enough to provide protection on 2 sides. He spent 3 days building a lean-to shelter from timber he felled from the ridge above. Green wood, heavy and difficult, and by the second evening, his hands had new blisters over old calluses, and his back made itself known whenever he bent or straightened. Hester watched him move through the cabin in the evenings with the careful economy of a man managing pain without acknowledging it, and said nothing about it directly. She heated water and left it in the basin near the fire without comment. She put the liniment from their supplies on the shelf where he would see it. He used it without mentioning that he had, and in the morning he went back to the timber work. This was one of the languages of their marriage, the language of things left where they could be found. On the 6th day that Hester took full account of the food, she laid out what they had on the table, the tins from the cabin shelf, and what remained of what they brought from Ridgeback, and did the arithmetic. She was precise about it. She did not round up. She did not allow herself the comfort of optimism in the numbers. 2.5 weeks at careful rationing. Perhaps 3 weeks if she reduced portions. After that, someone would need to go down to Ridgeback for provisions, and that meant spending money, and the money on the shelf beside the deed was not going to last. It was Orrin who found the answer, though it took him 2 days of walking the property to find it. And when he came back and told Hester what he'd found, she stood very still for a moment and looked at him. Mixed in among the regular firewood rounds stacked under the overhang were 15 cords of clean split fir. All of it dry, all of it uniform mill-length straight, split the kind of wood that a settlement with a working mill would pay honest money for. Not the ordinary scrap wood of a man heating his own hearth. This was commercial timber, seasoned and staged as though Edmund Greer had spent considerable time and effort preparing it for exactly this purpose. Hester looked at the wood. She looked at Orrin. He knew, she said, knew what she thought about the second letter in her coat pocket, stubborn enough to look past what first appears, that whoever came here would need a way to start, she said. He left them one. Orrin looked at the stacked cords with the expression of a man revising his understanding of a situation. There's enough here for 2 trips down the mountain, maybe 3. 1 trip to start, Hester said. See what Leland Drummond pays. Then we know what we're working with. She said it with the calm of a woman who had already run the calculation 3 different ways in her head and knew which variables she still needed. It was on the 9th night after the girls were in their bunks and the fire had settled and the cabin held the specific quiet of a place where the work of the day is finished, that Orrin asked her. He was sitting across the table from her, his hands around a tin cup of the weak tea she'd made from the dried herbs in the ceiling bundles, looking at the fire with the expression he wore when something had been sitting with him for a while and he had decided it was time. You're quiet in the afternoons, he said, the late ones, when the light changes. She looked at him. He was right. She had thought she'd managed it invisibly. She had been wrong, which she should have anticipated because Orrin was not a man who missed much about the people he loved, even when he gave every appearance of being occupied with other things. She looked at her hands on the table. I don't miss Ridgeback, she said. I want to be clear about that. I don't miss the rooms or the smell or the landlord or any of it. She paused. I miss knowing that someone is near. I miss the sound of neighbors, knowing that if something happened, there would be someone close enough to hear. He was quiet. The cabin is hidden, she said. That's part of what makes it safe. I understand that, but the same thing that keeps the world out also keeps it away. She looked up at him. I'm not saying we made the wrong choice. I'm saying it's the cost of the right one. And I wanted you to know I was paying it. Orrin set down the tin cup. He reached across the table and covered her hands with his. I'll think on it, he said. I don't have an answer right now. I'm not asking for an answer, she said. I just wanted you to know. He nodded. They sat like that for a while in the firelight, not speaking the way people sit who have been married long enough, that silence is not absence, but presence of a different kind. It was on the 12th day that May found the loose board. She had been playing on the floor near the shelves a private game that appeared to involve the cork from one of the tin canisters and a system of marks she'd made on the floorboards with a piece of charcoal. Hester was at the table. Orrin was outside working on the drainage channel he'd been cutting along the base of the cliff. Nora was on the flat boulder outside that she had claimed as her personal observation post. The sound was a hollow knock, different from the solid thud of the other boards, and May made it twice before she said anything. Mama. Hester looked up. May knocked on the board again with her small knuckles. Hester crossed the room and crouched beside her. She pressed the board. It gave very slightly at one end. Not broken, hinged almost. She pressed the other end and it rose a fraction. She got her fingers under the edge and lifted. Beneath the board was a shallow space perhaps 3 inches deep, packed around with dry moss to control moisture. And in the space wrapped in a piece of oilcloth tied with a leather cord was a book. Not a large book, smaller than a Bible. The oilcloth was stiff with age, and the cord was brittle. Hester untied it carefully and unfolded the oilcloth and held the book in both hands. The cover was plain, dark cloth, no title. The pages were thick and had yellowed at the edges. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting was the same as the letter. Slow, deliberate, the hand of a man who wrote rarely and took it seriously when he did. The date at the top of the first entry was April 14th, 1864. Edmund Greer's journal. Hester looked at May, who was watching her with calm attention. Go find your sister, Hester said quietly. Tell her you want to look at the birds from the observation rock. May considered this. There aren't any birds right now. There might be. There aren't. It's too cold. May. May looked at the journal, then at her mother. Then she stood up and went out through the cabin door, and a moment later Hester heard her telling Nora outside that there might be a bird, and Nora's immediate enthusiastic response, and the sound of them scrambling onto the flat boulder. Hester sat down on the floor with her back against the shelves and opened the journal and read. He had been 38 years old when he started writing. He'd come to Black Fern Pass in the spring of 1864 with his wife Catherine and their son, a boy of 4 named William. He'd built the cabin over the summer with timber from the ridge above which explained the size of the original woodpile, and he'd spent the autumn making it livable and the first winter learning what the mountain required of a person who intended to stay. The early entries were practical, what the soil would support, where the spring was a 1/4 mile up the slope to the northeast, exactly where the deed had vaguely suggested, the behavior of the snow at different elevations, the names of the few families within a day's ride. Then in February of 1865, the entries changed. Catherine had taken sick in January. William followed in February. The illness moved through the mountain communities that winter, like weather, taking the young and the old with particular attention. Edmund had written about it in the same slow, deliberate hand, but the sentences were shorter, less detail, as though he was writing only what he could bear to write. Catherine died on February 18th, 1865. William died on March 3rd, 1865. There was one entry after that dated March 10th, 1865. It said only, I am staying. I don't know why. I am staying. And then there was a gap of 6 months, and then the entries resumed shorter now, and spaced further apart the account of a man alone on a mountain, Learning how to remain. Hester read for a long time, longer than she intended. She read about the springs and summers that came and went, the small commerce he developed with the communities below the skilled timber work that had produced the 15 cords of fir now stacked under the overhang, the occasional neighbor who came and went. And here and there in entries from different years, mentions of a young man he called only T, who had come to Black Fern Pass in the early 1870s and stayed for several years learning the land, learning the timber work, learning whatever Edmund Greer had to teach. T is a quick study, one entry said. He understands what the mountain asked before I finish explaining it. T left this morning for Ridgeback, another entry said, perhaps 2 years later. He says there is work there, and I believe him. I did not tell him I was sorry to see him go. I am not the kind of man who says that kind of thing out loud. And then years later, near the end of the journal, T wrote from Ridgeback. He is doing well. He asked about the land, and I told him it was still standing. He asked what I intended to do with it, and I told him I was thinking about that. Hester turned to the last written page. The date was November 1895, 4 months before Edmund Greer died. I have asked T to find someone for this place, someone young enough to use it, someone with children so the rooms have voices in them again, someone who has worked for what they have and has not been given enough. He says he knows a family. He has been watching them for some time. I told him that was good enough for me. The boy would have been about the husband's age now. I am going to leave the wood ready. Hester sat on the floor of the cabin with the journal in her hands and looked at the hearthstone. The cabin that Edmund Greer had built for a family and had kept for 31 years alone, waiting for voices. She thought about the warm ash under her fingers on that first night. She thought about T, who had gone down to Ridgeback and done well there, and who had watched a family for some time, a family that worked hard and had not been given enough. She closed the journal carefully and held it in her lap. She did not cry. She had told Orange she did not miss Ridgeback, and that was true. She did not miss the rooms or the landlord or the 2 years of grain dust and thin walls. But sitting on the floor of a cabin built by a man who had lost everything and chosen to stay, and then 31 years later chosen to pass what he had kept to a family he had never met, she felt something move through her that she had not felt in a long time. Something that was the opposite of the feeling she'd had standing in those empty rooms on Birch Street on the last morning, looking at the rectangle of lighter color on the wall where the blue cloth had been. She had felt in those rooms the absence of a place that had never quite existed. She felt sitting on this floor the presence of one that had been waiting. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and put the journal in her apron pocket and stood up and opened the cabin door. "Nora," she called. "May, come inside." The truce with the loneliness came from an unexpected direction, as the things that actually help usually do. Orrin had gone up to the spring with the water barrel on the morning of the 12th day, which left Hester alone in the cabin with a batch of cornbread in the Dutch oven and the girls on the observation rock outside. She was standing in the sheltered space between the rock face and the cabin, checking the drainage channel Orrin had been cutting, when she heard movement on the track below. She straightened and stood still. A woman appeared at the foot of the track, perhaps 40 years old, broad-shouldered, wearing a practical coat and a hat that had seen considerable weather. She was moving with purpose and looking at the ground ahead of her in the way of someone following something, and behind her, some distance back, a brown and white milk cow was making its way up the slope with the self-satisfied expression of an animal that knows it is causing inconvenience. The woman looked up and saw Hester. She stopped. They looked at each other for a moment across the distance between the track and the rock face. "Willa Pruitt," the woman said, "the way you say your name when you are not expecting to need it and have had to find it quickly. My cow has lost its sense of direction." "Hester Holt," Hester said. "We're newly arrived." "I can see that." Willa Pruitt came closer, looking at the cabin tucked against the rock face with the frank curiosity of someone who had not expected to find another person at this elevation and was not bothering to disguise it. "Edmund Greer's place," she said. "It was not quite a question. He left it to my husband's family. We came up 2 weeks ago." Willa Pruitt looked at her steadily. Then she looked at the cabin. Then she looked back at Hester with an expression that was harder to read, something that involved recognition and something older than recognition. "He told me someone would come," she said. Hester went very still. "You knew him," she said. "Traded with him, off and on for years. He came down to the lower farms less and less as he got older, but he'd send word when he had timber ready. I'd send word back when I had put up more preserves than one woman needs. She said this without sentiment, as a plain account of an arrangement between practical people. Then, he talked about the land, near the end, said he'd made plans for it. Hester looked at her. There was something in the way Willa Pruitt held herself that said she was choosing her words with care, not because she was hiding something necessarily, but because she was thinking about what was right to say and in what order. "Mrs. Pruitt," Hester said, "you said he told you someone would come. Did he tell you anything else?" The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it. Willa Pruitt looked at the cabin door, then at Hester. "He wasn't always alone up here," she said. "Not in the early years. Not in the later ones either, though that's a different story." She paused. "There was a young man years back. Stayed a good while. Edmund taught him everything he knew about this land and this timber. When the boy went down to the valley to make his own way, Edmund said it was fine. Said the boy had learned what he came for." She looked at Hester directly. "You'll have met him, most likely, if you've been to Ridgeback." Hester thought about Leland Drummond, the name on the lumber transaction. The man Orrin needed to reach before he left on his quarterly run south. The man who had told Orrin at the mill yard Edmund told me someone would come. Said to give them fair price. "Drummond," Hester said. Something shifted in Willa Pruitt's expression. "That's him." Hester thought about that for a moment. She thought about tea, in the journal, and Leland Drummond at the mill yard, and an old man alone on a mountain who had asked someone he trusted to find the right family, and then gone about making sure there was something worth finding. "He organized everything," Hester said. It was not quite a question. "I don't know everything he did," Willa said. "I know what I was asked to do." Hester looked at her. Willa Pruitt reached into her coat pocket and brought out a small key on a leather cord. Hester recognized it. It was the shape of the latch key she'd found hanging on the peg inside the cabin door. The same simple iron, the same length. A copy, or the original. "He gave me this last fall," Willa said. "Said if someone came to the land, I should go up and make sure the place was ready. Keep it warm enough that the damp didn't set in. He said whoever came would need it to be a place they could use right away, not a project." She looked at the cabin. "I went up twice after he passed. Swept out. Laid fires. Made sure the tins were still sealed." She paused. "I didn't know when you'd come or if. I laid the last fire about 2 weeks before you arrived." Hester looked at the key in Willa Pruitt's hand. The warm ash. The swept floor. The wiped table. Not a mystery. A preparation. An act of foresight so deliberate and so quiet that it had looked at first like something else entirely. It had looked like a secret. It was not a secret. It was a gift arranged in advance by a man who had understood exactly what an arriving family would need and had made sure they would have it. She thought about the moment she'd stood in the empty rooms on Birch Street and felt the absence of something that had never quite existed. She thought about Edmund Greer, who had lost everything in the winter of 1865 and had kept going anyway, and who had spent the last year of his life making sure that whoever came next would find the place warm. She did not trust herself to speak immediately. Willa Pruitt watched her with the patient directness of a woman who has lived alone enough to be comfortable with silence. "Thank you," Hester finally said. Her voice was level. She made it level. "For keeping it, for being here." "He asked me to," Willa said simply. "He was a good man to have you on your side of things." She put the key back in her pocket. "I put up apple preserves last fall. More than one woman can use. I'll bring some Thursday if that suits." "It suits," Hester said. Willa Pruitt retrieved her cow from the fern bank where it had settled with evident satisfaction and headed back down the track, moving with the direct, unhurried pace of someone who has lived at altitude long enough to know that hurrying costs more than it saves. Hester stood in the sheltered space outside the cabin and watched her go. The truce came the following morning when Orrin was still on the mountain above, and the wagon had been loaded the night before for the run down to Ridgeback. Hester had loaded it herself, carrying the split fir from the woodpile through the crack in the rock one armload at a time while the girls slept, because the morning would be early and the work would be better done in the calm of the evening. She had been thinking about the axle. She had noticed 2 days earlier the way the right wheel sat slightly different than the left. A quarter inch, no more. The kind of thing you notice when you have been watching a wagon for years and you know the particular angles of it. She had pressed on the axle housing with her hand and felt the faintest give that should not have been there. She had not mentioned it to Orrin because she did not yet know what it meant, and she did not name problems she did not yet understand. But she thought about it. She was still thinking about it when the sound came from outside on the morning Orrin had planned to drive the wagon down to Ridgeback to meet Leland Drummond before he left on his quarterly run south. Not a crack, not a break. A groan, wooden and deep and final, followed by the particular sound of a wagon settling unevenly on the ground. She came through the cabin door and through the crack in the rock and found Orrin standing beside the wagon looking at the right wheel. The axle had given. Not dramatically. It had simply decided in the gray of early morning that it was done. She looked at the wheel. She looked at Orrin. He was standing with his hat in his hands. His face had the particular stillness of a man absorbing something he had been afraid of and is now having confirmed. The stillness before the weight of it settles fully. She went back inside. She took a piece of the cornbread she'd kept from yesterday and went back out and set it on the wagon's running board beside him without a word. Then she went back inside and began the morning's work. She heard him after a while go to the tool shelf, the sound of the hand axe being lifted from its peg, the sound of wood being tested, considered, selected, then the measured sound of a man working carefully at something he was figuring out as he went. He worked through most of the morning. At midday, she brought him the rest of the water and stood for a moment watching him finish the iron banding on the repair. The replacement piece was not elegant. It was a length of straight-grained fir shaped with the axe and the draw knife he'd found hanging on the cabin wall fitted to the housing with the iron banding he'd been saving in the wagon box for the kind of emergency that eventually arrives when you live by machinery and hope. He set the wheel down and it rolled true. He looked up at her. She handed him the water. "How long?" she said. "An hour to make sure the band seat's right. Then we can load." "I'll have it ready," she said. He made the sail by 1 hour. Leland Drummond was a square-built man of perhaps 50, with a face that had been weathered into a kind of permanent neutrality, an expression that gave nothing away whether he was pleased or not. He walked the length of the stacked fur, pressed his thumb into 3 or 4 pieces, and named a price. Orrin named a slightly higher one. They settled in the middle. Drummond counted coin into Orrin's hand without ceremony and turned to his next transaction. Then he stopped. "You the one living up at the Greer place," he said. "My family, yes," Orrin said. Drummond looked at him for a moment. Not the look of a man assessing a stranger. The look of a man recognizing something he has been expecting to see. "Edmund told me someone would come," he said. "Said to give them fair price." He moved on before Orrin could respond. Orrin stood in the mill yard with more money than he'd held in 2 years, watching Leland Drummond walk away with the straight-back gait of a man who has said what he intended to say and considers the matter settled. He bought what the family needed: proper flour in a sealed sack, a tin of dried apples, a wedge of cured pork, candles, and after a moment's thought, standing at the dry goods counter, while the woman behind it waited with the patience of someone accustomed to men who take their time, a small paper packet of flower seeds. The woman told him they were mountain hardy varieties: columbine, blue flax, something she called alpine forget-me-not. He tucked them in his coat pocket beside the repaired axle receipt and started the wagon up the mountain. He was thinking about Leland Drummond and what a man who has spent 30 years alone on a mountain does with his last year. He was thinking about the careful arithmetic of it, the 15 cords of fur staged and ready, the tin sealed with wax, the deed filed with the right law clerk, the letter tucked in the right fold, the kind of planning a man does when he is not planning for himself. When he came through the crack in the rock wall that evening, Hester was outside at the south face of the cliff, where the afternoon light lingered longest. She had a spade she'd found under the overhang, and she had been turning the soil along a narrow strip, working in the dark leaf mold from the base of the fern. She was not making a garden yet. She was preparing for one. He reached into his coat pocket and brought out the packet of seeds. He held it out to her. She looked at the packet. She read the names: columbine, blue flax, alpine forget-me-not. She looked at him in the way that meant more than she was about to say. "They'll come up next spring," she said. "That's all right," he said. "We'll be here." She smiled at that. Not the managing smile. Not the smile she wore when she was holding things together by will and habit. The real one, the one that started in her eyes and arrived at the rest of her face a moment later, as though it had traveled some distance to get there. She put the seeds in her apron pocket next to the journal and picked up the spade again. The seeds sat in Hester's apron pocket for 2 days before she planted them. She was not ready yet. Not because the ground was not prepared. She had spent 3 mornings turning the soil along the south face of the cliff, working in the dark leaf mold, and the fine grit that came off the rock face when the rain loosened it until the strip of earth was as good as mountain soil could reasonably be made to be in the space of a week. The ground was ready. She was waiting for something else. She could not have named it precisely. It was the feeling she sometimes got before doing something that mattered, the need to be fully present for it, rather than simply getting it done. The seeds were not urgent. The cured pork and the flour and the sealed tin of dried apples were urgent. The drainage channel and the roof and the horse's lean-to had all been urgent. The seeds were something different. The seeds were the first thing she had decided to do, not because it was necessary, but because she wanted to. She needed to be ready for that. On the morning of the third day, she woke before the others and lay in the bunk listening to the mountain outside and knew that today was the day. She got the fire going and heated water and made the cornmeal porridge, and when the girls were up and fed, and Orrin was on the slope above working on the upper section of the drainage channel, she took the seed packet from her apron pocket and set it on the table. Nora saw it immediately. "What's that, seeds?" Nora picked up the packet and examined it with the seriousness she applied to everything she examined. She read the names aloud slowly with the careful effort of a child who has been reading for 2 years and takes the work seriously. Columbine, blue flax, alpine forget-me-not. She looked up. "Are we planting them this afternoon?" Hester said, "when the light is right." May looked up from her porridge. She did not say anything, but she looked at the seed packet and then at Hester with the expression she wore when she understood that something important was about to happen and was arranging herself accordingly. Before the afternoon came, Willa Pruitt arrived. Hester heard her on the track and went out through the crack to meet her. Willa came up the slope with the same direct, unhurried stride, carrying a cloth-wrapped bundle under one arm and a small crock sealed with waxed cloth under the other. Behind her at a distance that suggested the cow had been left behind this time, by deliberate arrangement, the track was empty. "The apple preserves," Willa said, holding out the crock. "And bread. I baked yesterday." "Come in," Hester said. They sat at the pine table with the preserves open between them and the bread sliced and the weak herb tea in tin cups, and for a while they talked about practical things. The weather patterns at this elevation in late spring, the families within a morning's ride, their names and their situations, and who kept chickens and who would trade labor for labor and not think less of you for needing it. Willa knew everything about everyone in the way of a person who has lived in one place long enough to have outlasted several versions of each neighbor's story. Nora sat on her bunk with her bark and her charcoal and appeared to be drawing, but Hester could tell from the quality of her stillness that she was listening to every word. May sat cross-legged on the floor near the hearth with a piece of string she had been working into patterns, but her hands had stopped moving. Hester waited until there was a natural pause in the practical conversation. Then she said, "Mrs. Pruitt, can I ask you something directly?" Willa looked at her over her tin cup. "I'd prefer it." "Leland Drummond," Hester said. "He was here on this land, with Edmund Greer." "For about 4 years," Willa said. "In the 70s. He came up as a young man, maybe 20, 22. He'd been working the lower timber operations and heard about Edmund somehow. Edmund took him on." She paused. "I don't know the whole of what passed between them, but when Drummond left, he left differently than he'd arrived. There are people who change a place, and people the place changes. Drummond was the second kind." "Edmund wrote about him in the journal," Hester said. Willa looked at her. "You found the journal." May found the board. Willa glanced at May, who was still looking at her string pattern with elaborate casualness. The corner of Willa's mouth moved slightly. "Edmund said Drummond was the one who made the arrangements," Hester said. "Found us, watched us, brought it to the lawyer. That's my understanding." "Did Edmund know us before he asked Drummond to find someone?" "No," Willa said. "He knew what he was looking for. He told Drummond the kind of people, not the names." She set down her cup. He said he wanted a family that had been working hard and not getting ahead through any fault of their own. People who understood the difference between a problem and a condition. People who wouldn't see a crack in a rock wall and turn around. Hester sat with that for a moment. He trusted Drummond's judgment, she said. Completely, Willa said. He told me the last time I saw him in the fall that Drummond had found the right people. He seemed settled about it. The way a man seems when he has taken care of the last thing on the list. She looked at Hester directly. He was ready to go. He just needed to know the place would be used. The cabin was quiet. The fire spoke softly in the hearth. Outside, faint and far above the sound of Orrin's spade moving through stone and earth. Hester thought about an old man alone on a mountain in the fall of 1895, writing in a journal by firelight, knowing that the last thing on his list was done. She thought about what it meant to spend 31 years keeping something alive for a reason that took 31 years to arrive. Mrs. Pruitt, she said, you kept it warm for us. Twice you said, after he passed. I did. That was more than he asked of you. Willa picked up her tin cup again. He asked me to make sure the place was ready if someone came, she said. He didn't specify exactly how ready. I used my judgment. She drank her tea. I have a lot of judgment. Hester smiled. It arrived without planning. Willa stayed another hour. When she left, she paused at the crack in the rock wall and turned back to look at the cabin with its mossy roof and its steady curl of smoke and the ferns thick and green at the base of the cliff. The family to the east is the Hargrave family, she said. They have a boy of 8 and a girl of 10. Their mother would be glad of the company if you're willing to ride over one morning. She looked at Nora, who had appeared in the cabin doorway with the focused attention of someone who has been listening carefully and is now making sure she has heard correctly. They have a pashbao, Willa said to Nora specifically, named Biscuit. He is not as dignified as his name suggests. Nora's face achieved an expression of pure happiness. Willa went down the track and the mountain felt as Hester had noted it did each time this woman moved through the space near the cabin, slightly less sealed than before. The planting happened that afternoon as Hester had said it would. She called Orrin down from the slope when the light was at the angle she wanted, low and warm, and coming across the south face of the cliff at exactly the slant that showed how good the soil was. He came down with his spade still in his hand and dirt on his boots, in the look of a man who has been doing useful work and is pleased about it. We're planting, Hester said. It was not a question or an invitation. It was a statement of the next thing that was going to happen, delivered with the same calm certainty she used for everything that mattered. Orrin set down his spade. Tell me where. She had already marked the strip with small stones, set at intervals, which she had done that morning, while the light was different and she was thinking about spacing. The stones marked 3 sections, one for the columbine, one for the blue flax, one for the forget-me-not, along the edge nearest the rock face where it would get the most shelter. They knelt in the turned soil, all 4 of them. May had taken charge of the spacing without being asked. She measured the intervals between seed placements with a length of string she'd cut to the right dimension, a dimension she had apparently calculated based on information she had gathered from listening to Willa Pruitt describe the mature spread of mountain flowering plants, information Willa Pruitt had not known she was providing for this specific purpose. She placed the string down with precision, moved it, placed it again. Nora provided commentary. This hole is too shallow, she said, examining May's first mark in the soil with the critical authority of someone who has read about seeds and considers herself qualified. Seeds need to feel held. Seeds don't feel, May said. How do you know they do? I don't know that they do. I know that they should. Orrin caught Hester's eye over the tops of their daughters' heads. She looked back at him with an expression that communicated several things at once, that she found this argument both familiar and dear, that she was not going to intervene, and that she wanted him to witness it fully, because these were the moments that needed witnesses. She pressed her thumb into the soil and made a hole and dropped a seed into it and pressed the earth gently back over it. She did this in the way she had done everything in the past 3 weeks, not performing it, not making it mean more than it was, simply doing it fully and carefully with the whole of her attention. But underneath the simplicity of the gesture, she was aware of what it was. This was the first thing she had put into this earth with the intention of returning to harvest it. This was the first thing she had done here, not to survive the present, but to claim the future. She was planting flowers. Not food, not practical things. Flowers which would come up next spring in colors she had not yet seen against rock. She was still learning. She was planting them because they would be beautiful and because this was her land, and she intended for the first time in a very long time to have beautiful things in it. May reached over and took her hand for a moment briefly, the way she sometimes did when she understood something that was not being spoken. Hester held her daughter's small, dirt-covered hand in her own dirt-covered hand for a moment, and then they both went back to the work. When the planting was done, Orrin stood and looked at the marked row with the quiet satisfaction of a man looking at something that has been done properly. "They'll come up next spring," Hester said, as she had said to him when he gave her the seeds. "That's all right," he said as he had answered then. "We'll be here." She stood and brushed the dirt from her skirt and looked at the south face of the cliff for the light was still warm and the freshly turned soil was dark against the pale rock. "Yes," she said, "we will." That evening after supper, after the tin cups were washed and the Dutch oven hung back on its hook and the girls were settled, Hester took the journal from where she had placed it on the shelf beside the deed and sat at the table with it. She had read it through once. She had been carrying it with her for days, and the way you carry something you know you are not finished with. Now she opened it again, not to read from the beginning, but to look at what she had not yet examined closely. She turned to the back pages, the last entries, the November 1895 record of a man settling his affairs. She read through the final entries again slowly. Edmund Greer had been a man of few words on paper, as he had apparently been a man of few words in person. The late entries were plain and direct. He had described the winter he expected, the condition of the woodpile, the status of the tins. He had noted the names of the families below who might be useful to whoever came after him, including Willa Pruitt, and he had noted beside her name in his slow, deliberate hand, "She will help if you ask her. She may help before you ask." Hester smiled at that. She turned past the last entry. She turned to the inside of the back cover. It was there. She almost missed it. The back cover was dark cloth, the same as the front, and the interior was a plain pale paper that had yellowed with the years. She would not have looked at it carefully at all, except that she had the same habit that had found the second letter in the fold of the legal envelope, of checking every surface before she closed something. In the lower right corner of the inside back cover, drawn in ink that had faded almost to nothing, almost but not quite, was a map, small, perhaps 3 inches across. The lines were thin and careful, the work of a man who drew with the same slow deliberateness that he wrote. She brought the candle close. She could see the rock face represented by a line of small marks, the cabin a square, the track leading down to the lower road, and to the northeast past the spring she had already found up and over a ridge. She had not yet crossed a second square, not a structure, a field. Written beside it in lettering so small she had to angle the candle twice: South Meadow. Spring water feeds it, soil is deep, never used it, did not need to alone. She stared at the map for a long time. She had known the deed said 37 acres. She had understood in the abstract that 37 acres was substantial. But they had been so occupied with the immediate territory, the cabin and the rock face and the slope above and the track below, that the full extent of the land had remained abstract. Somewhere beyond the spring, somewhere beyond where she had walked. Edmund Greer had known something else was possible on this land. A meadow with deep soil and a water source. Ground that could be farmed. He had lived alone for 31 years and he had not needed it. But he had known it was there, and he had drawn it, and he had put the drawing where someone looking carefully would find it. Not where someone casual would find it. Where someone like her would find it. She sat for a long time with the candle close to the map and traced the lines with one finger without quite touching the ink. She thought about what she was looking at. Not just a map, a declaration. A man who had lost everything telling the future in ink that had almost faded, that the future was larger than it currently appeared. That what she could see from where she stood was not all there was. She closed the journal carefully and held it in both hands. Then she got up and went to the bunk where Orrin was sleeping and put her hand on his shoulder. He came awake quickly, the way he always did, with his eyes open and his attention present before he had fully surfaced from sleep. "Come to the table," she said quietly. He came. He sat across from her in the firelight, blinking slowly. She set the journal between them and opened it to the back cover and angled the candle so he could see. He leaned forward and looked at the map. She watched him look at it. She watched the moment when he understood what he was seeing, the particular change that moved across his face when a man revises what he believed to be the size of something. South Meadow, he said, reading the small notation. Deep soil, she said. Springs fed. He looked at the map for a long time without speaking. He never used it, Orrin said finally. He didn't need to, Hester said. Alone. Orrin looked at her across the table. The fire spoke in the hearth. Outside, the mountain was dark and still. We could put crops in, he said, next spring, if the soil is what he says. We'd need to see it first, she said. Yes. Tomorrow, she said. He looked at her. I'd like to see it tomorrow, she said. Both of us. We'll take the girls. He nodded slowly. Tomorrow, he said. She closed the journal. She went to the shelf and placed it carefully beside the deed, the two documents of this place side by side, the legal paper, and the human one, the official account, and the true account. She went to the bunk. She lay down. She listened to the fire settle and the mountain breathe outside, and her daughters sleep in the warmth of the room that Edmund Greer had built for a family he'd lost and kept for 31 years on faith that it would be used again. She did not stay awake long. She had done her thinking. The map was in her memory and the morning was coming, and there was a meadow on the other side of a ridge she had not yet crossed, and she wanted to see it with fresh eyes. She slept. The morning broke clear and cold, with a light that came off the peaks at a low angle and turned the spruce needles to copper. Hester had the fire going and the porridge made, and the girls dressed before the sun had cleared the eastern ridge, and by the time Orrin had saddled the horse and brought him out through the crack in the rock wall, they were ready. They went on foot. The horse came with them for the first part of the way because the track was rough enough that Orrin preferred to lead him rather than ride. The girls walked between their parents, May, with her usual composure, and Nora with her usual catalog of observations delivered at regular intervals. The spring was 15 minutes up the slope, exactly where Edmund had noted it, tucked behind a granite outcropping in a shallow bowl of rock that collected the water from above and let it out in a steady, clear stream that ran east before going underground. Hester had been here twice before with water buckets. She stopped now and looked at it differently, looking at the volume of the flow and the direction it ran. It runs east, she said. Downslope toward the meadow, Orrin said, reading the same information. Natural irrigation, she said. They kept going. The ridge above the spring was steeper than it had looked from below, a scramble of loose granite and old spruce root that required hands in some places. Orrin helped the girls up the worst sections with the patient efficiency of a man who has spent years navigating rough terrain and trusts his body to find the way. Hester went up on her own, choosing her footholds with care, not rushing. At the top of the ridge, she stopped. Below her, running south for perhaps 400 yards before meeting the next rise of rock, was the meadow. It was not dramatic in the way of mountain vistas. It did not have the grandeur of a view from a peak or the spectacle of a waterfall. It was simply a long, quiet stretch of ground, sheltered on three sides by rock and timber, open to the south where the sun would reach it longest. The grass was still the pale gold of winter, but beneath it where the spring melt had come through the dark earth showed in patches, and even from the ridge, Hester could see it was the deep rich color that meant depth and life. The spring water ran along the western edge of the meadow in a shallow channel that Edmund had apparently cut years ago, or that had formed naturally and he had simply noted. Either way, the water was there, moving quietly through the pale grass, feeding the ground below. Nora stood beside her and looked at it. It's big, Nora said. It is. Edmund had this the whole time. The whole time. Why didn't he use it? Hester looked at the meadow. She thought about a man who had built a cabin for two people and a child, and then for 31 years had been one person, and what one person needed from a piece of land was different from what four people needed. He was waiting for the right number of people, she said. Nora considered this. That's us, she said. That's us, Hester agreed. May had gone ahead down the far side of the ridge, moving through the pale grass toward the center of the meadow, with her arms slightly out, as if she were steadying herself on a surface that required balance. She stopped in the middle and stood very still and looked at the ground around her. Then she crouched down and pressed both hands flat into the earth, and held them there for a moment, the same gesture she had made on the hearthstone their first night, checking for warmth. She looked up at Hester. "It's good," May said. She said it the way she said most things, simply, as a report of a fact she had established through direct investigation. Hester felt something move through her chest that she did not try to name. She had learned over the past 3 weeks to let the large things be large without immediately trying to reduce them to language. She walked down into the meadow and stood in it. The ground was solid under her feet, not the thin rocky soil of the slope above, but real depth, the kind that built over centuries of grass dying and renewing in a sheltered place where the water came reliably and the sun stayed long. She bent and pressed her fingers in as May had done, and felt the soil give cleanly, no resistance, no rock just beneath the surface. She straightened. She turned in a slow circle the way Nora had turned in the center of the cabin on that first night, looking at everything with systematic attention. The shelter of the surrounding rock and timber, the water channel along the western edge, the angle of the southern exposure where the light would fall longest in the growing season. The scale of it, 400 yards by perhaps 200, enough for real cultivation, enough for a kitchen garden, 10 times the size of the strip she'd been preparing at the south face of the cliff, enough for grain, if the season was long enough for hay, enough for a life that produced rather than merely survived. She looked at Orrin, who had come down from the ridge and was standing at the edge of the meadow with his hands on his hips, reading the ground, the way he read timber, looking for what it was telling him. "He wasn't leaving us a cabin," she said. Orrin looked at her. "He was leaving us a farm," she said. Orrin looked back at the meadow. He looked at the water channel. He looked at the southern exposure and the shelter of the rock faces on the north and west. He did the same calculations she had done. It did not take him long. "Next spring," he said, "we'll need seed before the snow comes," she said. "Real seed, grain and vegetable, not flowers. We'll need to talk to the Hargraves about what grows at this elevation. Willa will know." "Willa knows everything," Orrin said. "She does," Hester said. "We should use that." She walked the length of the meadow once from the north end, where the ridge came down, to the south end, where the ground began to rise again toward the next rock face. She walked it slowly, the way you walk something you are memorizing, the way you walk a thing you intend to know. At the south end, she turned and looked back north up the length of the meadow to where her family stood, Orrin at the edge watching her. Nora beside him, asking him something he was answering with a single word. May still in the center, still crouched near the earth, having found something in the soil that interested her and was conducting her investigation with complete absorption. Hester stood at the south end of her meadow and looked at her family in the morning light. She thought about Birch Street. She thought about the rectangle of lighter color on the wall where the blue cloth had been, and the grain dust, and the mice, and the feeling of working carefully to make something feel cared for that had never quite agreed to be. She thought about the landlord's iron and the 3 weeks of doors closing, and the morning they had packed what they owned into a wagon that took no time to fill. She thought about a legal envelope with a second envelope hidden in the fold. She thought about a man she had never met who had asked another man he trusted to find the right people, and had then gone about making sure there was something worth finding. A cabin swept clean, fires laid, tin sealed, wood staged for sale. A map drawn in fading ink on the inside back cover of a journal, placed beneath a loose board for someone careful enough to look. Not a gift. Something more deliberate than a gift. A preparation. A faith in the future expressed in the only language Edmund Greer apparently knew, which was the language of work done carefully and in advance for someone else's benefit. She walked back up the length of the meadow. When she reached Orrin, she put her hand in his, and they stood together for a moment looking at the land that was theirs, all of it, the 37 acres from the rock face to the south, rise from the spring to the eastern timber, the cabin and the wood pile, and the south face where the seeds were planted, and the meadow where next year's crop had not yet been imagined. "What are you thinking?" Orrin said. She thought about the question. "I'm thinking about what it means to own something," she said. "Not the legal part, the other part." "Tell me." "The part where it becomes yours," she said. "Not when you sign the paper. When you've worried about the roof in the rain. When you've dug the drainage and laid the fires and turned the soil. When you've put something in the ground you intend to come back and harvest." She looked at the meadow. "When you know the difference between every corner of it in morning light and evening light. when your children have their hands in it. She paused. That's when it's yours. Oren held her hand and said nothing for a moment. It's ours, he said. Yes, she said. It is. They went back over the ridge. The descent was easier than the climb, as descents usually are, and Nora narrated most of it and May moved through it with her characteristic economy of motion, and Oren helped both girls over the loose granite without appearing to notice that he was doing it, which was one of the quiet skills of fatherhood that Hester had always considered among his best qualities. At the spring, she stopped and filled the water bucket she had thought to bring because she was a woman who brought the bucket when there was a chance of filling it, and then they went back down through the spruce to the rock face and through the crack in the wall and into the cabin that was warmer inside than the morning air outside because the fire had held through their absence. Willa came Thursday as she had said she would, and the Thursday after that. She brought the apple preserves on the first visit and information on the second, the names of seed suppliers who serviced the mountain communities and what varieties had done well at this elevation in the years she'd been farming. She brought on her third visit the Hargrave girl, who was 10 and serious, and took one look at Nora and May and appeared to make an immediate internal decision about them that was positive and final. The Hargrave girl's name was Ida, and she had opinions about everything and expressed them with a directness that Nora found immediately congenial, and May found quietly amusing. The mountain felt less sealed each time Willa came down the track. On an evening in the fifth week when the light had gone long and gold, the way mountain light does in late spring, when the days are finally earning their length, Hester stood outside the crack in the wall and looked at the south face of the cliff where she had planted the seeds. Nothing yet. Nothing would be yet. She had not expected anything. But she looked at the turned soil along the strip she had prepared, and she thought about next spring. The columbine, which would be the first to show purple and precise. The blue flax, which would come later and be the color of mountain sky on a clear morning. The forget-me-not along the edge near the rocks, small and persistent, and exactly what it said it was. She thought about May's hands in the soil. She thought about Nora's running commentary on the quality of each planting hole. She thought about Oren handing her the seed packet across the turned earth of an evening and what his face had looked like when she smiled at him. She put her hand in her apron pocket and felt the shape of the journal there, which she had been carrying these past days the way you carry something you are not finished with. She took it out and stood with it for a moment in the Montguan gold light. She opened it to the back cover and looked at the map one more time. The ink had almost faded. Almost, but not quite. She looked at the little square that meant the meadow, at the careful lines of the water channel, at the notation in Edmund Greer's slow, deliberate hand never used it. Did not need to alone. She closed the journal. She went back inside. The fire was going, and the iron pot was on the hook, with the cured pork and the dried apples making the single room smell of warmth and food. Nora was at the pine table with her bark and her charcoal explaining something to May at considerable length. May was listening with her dark eyes and her patient skepticism and the piece of string she had been making into patterns for the better part of a week. Oren was at the shelf making a note with the stub of pencil they kept behind the deed, adding something to the list of things they needed from Ridgeback on the next run down. Hester hung her coat on the wooden peg beside the door, the same peg that had held Edmund Greer's coat for 31 years before it held hers. She put the journal on the shelf beside the deed where she had decided it belonged, the legal document and the human one, the official record and the true one. She sat down at the table. "Mama," Nora said without looking up from her drawing, "when the flowers come up, can we show Mrs. Pruitt?" "We can," Hester said. "I think she'd like the blue ones best." Hester looked at her daughter, the gap-toothed certainty of her, the way she made pronouncements about other people's preferences with the confidence of a child who has been paying close attention and trusts what she has observed. "I think you're right," Hester said. May looked up from her string and met Hester's eyes and said nothing, which was May's way of saying everything. Oren set down his pencil and turned from the shelf and saw his wife at the table with both daughters and the fire at her back and the deed and the journal on the shelf beside her, and he looked at her for a moment with the particular quality of attention a man gives to something he has been afraid of losing and has not lost. She met his eyes. He came and sat at the table. Outside, the mountain held them on every side, rock and spruce, and the deep blue of a Colorado evening coming down over the pass. The fire gave back what the day had taken. The smoke went straight up through the clean chimney and out into the dark above the cliff face and disappeared into the mountain air. Nora reached across the table and took May's hand. May was already reaching. From the road below, from the track that wound through the old spruce and the granite from any angle a traveler might approach Black Fern Pass on a spring evening, there was nothing to see. Only rock, only shadow, only the patient green of fern pressed against the cliff face by the last of the day's wind. But behind 30 feet of solid mountain, a lamp burned in the window of a hidden cabin, and a family sat together at a pine table on their own land, and the fire gave back everything the day had taken. Hester Holt looked at the flame in the lamp and thought about the woman she had been on Birch Street who had hung a blue cloth on a window and made it beautiful and known in the place where true things are known. That beautiful was not the same as hers. And then she looked at her daughter's hands clasped across the table and at her husband's face in the firelight and at the deed on the shelf that had her husband's name on it, but would have in every way that actually mattered her name on it too, and at the journal beside it, Edmund Greer's true account of a life lived alone in faith that the future would know what to do with what he left. She looked at all of it. Then she reached across the table and covered Nora's free hand with hers, and Nora looked up, surprised and pleased in the way of children who are unexpectedly held, and did not ask why, which was the right thing, because there was no single answer. There was only this room and this fire and this land and these people and the spring that was coming and the seeds in the ground and the meadow waiting on the other side of a ridge that was theirs to cross whenever they chose. There was only the particular warmth of a place that had decided after 31 years of waiting to be a home again. And Hester Holt, who had carried the family through 3 weeks of closed doors and one cracked open mountain, and 100 small emergencies that required her best thinking and her quietest courage, sat in the firelight of a room that was finally completely irrevocably hers, and was for the first time in as long as she could remember simply still.